Welcome to Useful Idiots Monday Morning, where we watch the Sunday morning news show so that you don't have to. I'm Aaron Maté. Katie Halper is away this week. So, sitting in her place is fan favorite, friend of the show, Brianna Joy Gray, host of the Bad Faith podcast. Bri, welcome to Monday Morning.
It is a real pleasure to be here, Aaron. I am a faithful watcher of Monday mornings, and I have often said, one, that Katie is the hardest working woman in show business, hardest working woman on the left, and also that I am the number one fan of Useful Idiots. So it really is a pleasure to be here.
Well, I believe this is your Monday morning debut, and what a week to be doing it when, some weeks you have arguments about whether Trump took classified documents to Mar-a-Lago improperly. In some weeks you have seismic regime change in the Middle East and the world newly on fire. So you got the seismic Middle East regime change week. So we're very happy to have you. Yeah. All right. Well, we are going to start. We're going to start actually with a flashback. So obviously the big news right now is that Bashar al-Assad of Syria, the longtime ruler of Syria and the member of the Assad dynasty, his father ruled Syria before him, has been ousted after more than a decade of war in Syria, fueled by many outside powers, including the U.S. Assad has fled the country. His forces melted away as insurgents advanced. So we're going to hear a lot about Syria today, and obviously Syria is now dominating the news. But we want to flash back to the one rare moment on corporate TV when the truth about Syria was told. And basically, this moment happened, and then it will never happen again. This was when Jeffrey Sachs was on Morning Joe a few years ago. Jeffrey Sachs, he's been a guest on this show. Bri, you've interviewed him as well. Professor at Columbia, very reputable person with a lot of establishment credentials. And he made the mistake, though, of telling the truth about Syria and the U.S. role in corporate TV. And I don't think he's been allowed on MSNBC ever since. But let's just, for a summary of what has happened in Syria and our role in Syria, which is what we should be most concerned with living in the West. This is what Jeffrey Sachs had to say about our role in the Syrian conflict.
Out of control, this could escalate.
It's true, but I think we have to step back and not put this in partisan terms. This is a U.S. mistake that started 7 years ago. And I remember the day on your show when President Obama said, Assad must go. And I looked at you and Joe and I said, how's he going to do that? Where's the policy for that?
Right.
And we know they sent in the CIA to overthrow Assad. The CIA and Saudi Arabia together in covert operations tried to overthrow Assad. It was a disaster. Eventually it brought in both ISIS as a splinter group to the jihadists that went in. It also brought in Russia. So we have been digging deeper and deeper and deeper. What we should do now is get out and not continue to throw missiles, not have a confrontation with Russia. 7 years has been a disaster under Obama, continuing under Trump. This is what I would call the permanent state. This is the CIA, this is Pentagon, wanting to keep Iran and Russia out of Syria, but no way to do that. And so we have made a proxy war in Syria. It's killed 500,000 people, displaced 10 million. And I'll say predictably so, because I predicted it 7 years ago that there was no way to do this and that it would make a complete chaos. So what I would plead to President Trump is get out. Like his instinct told him, by the way. That was his instinct. But then all the establishment, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Pentagon, everybody said, no, that's irresponsible. But his instinct is right. Get out. We've done enough damage, 7 years. And now we really risk a confrontation with Russia that is extraordinarily dangerous, reckless.
So that was Jeffrey Sachs in 2018, very prescient. And what has happened since? Well, the U.S. did not get out when Trump ordered U.S. troops to leave Syria. He was undermined by his top generals who basically ignored his order. And then Trump quickly caved and said, okay, we're in Syria to take the oil. which was accurate. The U.S. wanted him to say that we're there to fight ISIS, but actually he was correct in saying we're there to take the oil. And they wanted to take the oil of Syria because they wanted to deprive Syria of resources as basically punishment for the fact that Syria defeated the CIA armed insurgency that Jeffrey Sachs was talking about, and to make Syrians suffer, so that if you can't achieve regime change via, an insurgency, you can now try it by looting Syria's resources and also imposing sanctions, which the U.S. did, that crushed Syria's economy even more and prevented it from rebuilding. So these factors help contribute to what we just saw, that a very weak Syrian state finally collapsed and Assad was forced to flee the country. So now we're in a position where what the U.S. has been fueling for a long time has succeeded. But who has led the rebellion? Who is the leader of the ouster? Well, it's someone who the U.S. has placed on the U.S. terrorism list. And this is where things get awkward. So the leader of the rebels who ousted Assad, the so-called rebels, his name is Mohammed al-Jilani. He's the founding leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria and the former deputy to the founding caliph of ISIS, al-Baghdadi. And this is from 2017. This is the U.S. Embassy in Syria putting out a wanted notice for Jilani. It says, "Stop this terrorist, Mohammed al-Jilani." And there's a $10 million reward for his capture, or for information leading to his capture. And now we know exactly where he is. He's in Damascus leading the rebellion. So this is the awkward position that the U.S. is in. They fueled an insurgency that they knew was dominated by Al-Qaeda adjacent figures like Jilani. And now it succeeded. So what comes next? It remains to be seen. So let's turn to, first of all, Joe Biden. This wasn't from the Sunday news shows, but it's important to play because we forget sometimes that he's still the president. This is how Joe Biden welcomed the news of Assad's overthrow.
The upshot for all this is, for the first time ever, neither Russia nor Iran nor Hezbollah could defend this abhorrent regime in Syria. And this is a direct result of the blows that Ukraine, Israel have delivered upon their own self-defense with unflagging support of the United States.
So that's important. He's noting the connection between Syria and other proxy wars that the U.S. is fueling, namely in the Middle East, Hezbollah, he mentions, and Russia and Ukraine, where he says that Syria's allies have been weakened in both places with the unflagging support of the U.S. And he's right. These proxy wars did weaken and did distract and tie up Russia and Hezbollah. And now the rebels led by the former leader of Al-Qaeda have taken advantage. So Biden is tacitly taking credit for the overthrow of Assad here. And what he doesn't mention is the years of CIA arming of the insurgency that Al-Qaeda dominated. But we'll hear more about that in a second.
Over the past 4 years, my administration pursued a clear and principled policy towards Syria. First, we made clear from the start sanction on Assad would remain in place unless he engaged seriously in a political process to end the civil war, as outlined by the UN Security Council resolution passed in 2015. But Assad refused, so we carried out a comprehensive sanction program against him and all those responsible for atrocities against the Syrian people. Second, we maintained our military presence in Syria, our counter-ISIS, to counter the support of local partners as well on the ground, their partners, never ceding an inch of territory, taking out leaders of ISIS, ensuring that ISIS can never establish a safe haven there again. Third, we've supported Israel's freedom of action against Iranian networks in Syria and against actors aligned with Iran who transported lethal aid to Lebanon. And when necessary, ordered the use of military force against Iranian networks to protect U.S. forces. Our approach has shifted the balance of power in the Middle East. Through this combination of support for our partners, sanctions, and diplomacy, and targeted military force when necessary, we now see new opportunities opening up for the people of Syria and for the entire region.
Yes, there are new opportunities, and Israel is taking full advantage of them. Immediately upon Assad's ouster, Israel invaded Syria, is taking now more territory than even the size of Gaza, and has launched a series of airstrikes around the country against Syrian army stockpiles. So he's right. There is an opportunity now for Middle East because Syria was a key part of the axis of resistance. It's through Syria that Hezbollah got weapons from Iran. And that's why it was targeted for regime change, because it was a part of the bloc that resists Israeli aggression. And finally, that succeeded. So Biden's taking credit for that. He mentions the sanctions, which again are placed nominally on Assad and his circle, but they hurt Syrian civilians. They raised the price of food and fuel, as U.S. officials quietly brag about. And also the U.S. military occupation, which we never talk about. Like, why do we have troops in Syria? He says it's to fight ISIS, but actually the U.S. has barely fought ISIS. They've just been stealing Syria's oil, as Trump openly bragged about a few years ago. So that's Biden's kind of accurate summation of what's happening. He's mentioning that the U.S. played a critical role.
Yeah, I'm curious whether you were surprised at all by this tacit, kind of explicit admission of the proxy, the nature of this being a proxy conflict. Is that something that you've heard Biden acknowledge in the past with respect to Syria, or does that seem like a sort of a slip up, or just kind of a novel pivot from your perspective?
Well, it's interesting. He has made, back when he was vice president. In fact, we'll play the clip shortly. He blurted out the truth about Syria when he was vice president, and I'll find the clip and we can play it for those who haven't seen it. He was speaking before a Harvard audience, and he basically admitted, oh yeah, there was no moderate rebels inside Syria, contrary to what we've been saying. The rebellion was dominated by Al-Qaeda, and they were armed with tens of millions of dollars worth of weapons. It's actually more than that, or tens of millions of tons of weapons. And he blamed our allies like Saudi Arabia and Turkey for that. He omitted the U.S. role. But he had to apologize for that, because that was the truth, and that there was a proxy war. He just made the mistake of admitting it, and also leaving out the fact that the U.S. was involved. So he has blurted this out before, but this is like a prepared remark, and he's, as you say, he's openly taking credit and acknowledging, yes, this is a proxy conflict. Has nothing to do with concern about the Syrian people. The fact that Assad is an authoritarian, repressive leader has to do with advancing U.S.-Israeli hegemony, and it has taken a step forward by taking out a key member of the axis of resistance.
Yeah, I found myself a little surprised that there was this pretty quick jump, an explicit jump to pulling in the influence of the Ukraine-Russia war, especially given that in that particular conflict, I think we've seen more of a sort of bipartisan shift toward a critical stance. And we've seen in other conflicts, other kind of U.S. intervention. We saw it play out, I think, in the election in a way that I think has been under commented upon, the extent to which, the anti-war right and the anti-war left did see Ukraine as a motivating factor, did see the domestic economic issues and their frustration over inflation as linked to unfavorably how much money is being sent abroad. So when I've seen so many of these pundits, and we're going to get to more of these clips, kind of openly brag about the extent to which this regime change has been possible because Russia has been weakened by our proxy war in Ukraine, teeing up the argument that we are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian and risk all these Ukrainian lives for these objectives in the Middle East and beyond. It feels squishy to me. And there's a weird sort of gap between these pundits and politicos still not seeming to recognize how that falls on the ears of the anti-war, anti-interventionist, American first populace.
Yep. Well, they presupposed the U.S. right to be able to go and have these proxy wars around the world and have us pay for it. And they think it's a good thing that we're just constantly devoted to bleeding our allies. And so in moments like this, when there's a success, quote unquote, the mask slips off. And yeah, all these proxy wars are connected, because they all come down to being waged for the same reason, which is to advance U.S. hegemony. And so, you can speculate as to why, for example, the Biden team was so devoted to having a proxy war in Ukraine rather than negotiating with Russia. And you can't discount the fact that possibly it was like revenge against Russia, because when Russia intervened in Syria, that stopped the advance of the U.S.-backed proxy war that was then going on in Syria. And so by tying up Russia and Ukraine, that was a way to bleed Russia and force it to allocate its resources back into a different battle zone. And the U.S. allied rebels like Al-Qaeda have taken full advantage. So and of course in Israel too. I mean, it's not even, the Israeli officials bombing Syria hundreds of times. You have Israel arming some of the insurgent groups that have operated in Syria over the years. And Netanyahu went to the border and said this was he basically took partial credit for the ouster of Assad. So they're definitely all interconnected. And sometimes you have a moment where that's actually acknowledged.
Yeah.
Let me play for you the clip of Joe Biden. This is Joe Biden in 2014. Okay, when he was a bit more lucid, but he has this habit of committing gaffes where he blurts out the truth sometimes, just like Trump. And listen to what he said about Syria. The only mistake he makes is he blames all this on our allies like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, when in fact the U.S. played an integral role here in this operation.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined.
Is the volume okay on this? It's a little quiet.
It's a little quiet. I can make it out, but I don't know about the audience.
Okay.
To take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world.
So notice what he says there, that the people being supplied with weapons were not moderate rebels. They were al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, which is the same thing. Nusra is the Al-Qaeda group that Jolani, the current leader of the rebels, is the leader of. They changed the name to a different one, but that's who Jolani was leading. And that's who received the weapons that the U.S. and its allies were supplying. That's Joe Biden's admission. And the audio is a bit low, so I'm going to find a better quality clip of that. We can play later. We can return to it. But it's a really damning admission from Joe Biden. And he had to go apologize for saying it to Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Again, not because he got anything wrong, but just because he told the truth. That's another example where the nature of the proxy war was acknowledged. So let's turn now to Congressmember Mike Turner. He is the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, and he's going to, be asked about the main dilemma that the U.S. faces now is how do we deal with the fact that the leader of the insurgency that ousted Assad is led by a guy on the U.S. terrorism list with a $10 million bounty on his head because he's the founding leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria and the former deputy to the founding caliph of ISIS. So here is Mike Turner.
Of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. He is the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. People call it HTS. You're going to hear a lot about that in the coming days and weeks. The rebel group that appears to be taking control, but they are working also with the prime minister. The United States government has a $10 million bounty on the head of Jawlani. Do you think the United States still should keep that? Should Americans be concerned that this will mean something in terms of impact for terror threats to the United States?
Well, this is a terrorist organization and group, but this is not going to be just a passing of power and authority. It could be. We'll have to obviously watch that. One of the things that we do see here, though, is this is a diplomatic failure with respect to the United States and Turkey. The U.S. has troops in Syria. This is on the border of Turkey. Turkey is a NATO ally. The United States is working with the Kurds. This really could have been an opportunity for the United States to work to try to resolve the issue between the Kurds, Turkey, and the United States in working with Turkish interests in Syria. Hopefully, this could be an opportunity where there could be a diplomatic support there that hopefully could have help in this transition in Syria.
So note how he didn't basically answer the question, like, what do you think about the fact that the leader of the insurgency is Mohammed al-Jawlani, who's on the U.S. terrorism list? And she didn't mention this, but he's the founding leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria. He just kind of brushed by that and went on to how we should have dealt with Turkey earlier, when in fact we did have an agreement with Turkey. And Turkey is a major player here because al-Jawlani and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is rebranded Al-Qaeda, they launched this attack on the rest of Syria from Idlib, which is basically under Turkish protection. And Turkish-backed mercenaries were also involved in this operation. So Turkey has played a duplicitous role here in that they claim to support Palestine, while meanwhile backing an insurgency that wants to undermine Syria's role in the axis of resistance against Israel. So that's just something that's obscured here.
So, Aaron, what do you think he means when he says that this was an opportunity for diplomacy? Is that just throat clearing to avoid the question, or what's he getting at?
Yeah, I think maybe he means we should have had more, like we should have been a bigger player here in Turkey's problem is like Turkey, A, wants to control large parts of Syria, and B, Turkey also wants to expel the Kurds that are in Syria. And I think he's saying we should have helped Turkey maybe expel the Kurds because that would have given us even more influence. Because meanwhile, the U.S. actually works with the Kurds as its own. It's all very confusing. So I don't actually know like what he means there, but I do. He was definitely avoiding the core issue of like, hey, the leader of the insurgency is on our wanted list with a $10 million bounty because he's the founding leader of Al-Qaeda. He just kind of avoids that.
Yeah. Oh, and
okay.
I feel like I should say, to play my Katie role, that people should be liking the video and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already.
Katie would be proud. Thank you, Brie. Okay, I found that clip of Biden. Let's actually hear it in higher audio quality.
Constant cry was that our biggest
Here we go.
problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world.
So there it is. Just he lays it out pretty plain there. The insurgency was dominated by Al-Qaeda and jihadis coming from around the world, and that is who is behind the insurgency that it just won. And so that's an issue now that the U.S. has huge responsibility for, and that puts Syria in a whole new phase. And we should say, in fairness, that Jolani, the head of the insurgency, he said that we vowed to treat minorities fairly. We're not going to persecute them. But for the minorities of Syria, the Christians, the Druze, Alawite, Shia, they remember what happened in territories that the rebels attacked during this decade-long dirty war. And there, as one New York Times correspondent put it, there was sectarian mass murder. There was a whole bunch of atrocities committed by these same insurgent groups. So Jolani is speaking nice now. He's saying the right things, but we'll see if his words will translate into actual action from an insurgency that is composed of people that have a lot of blood on their hands too. So yeah.
And I don't want to prematurely, jump ahead, Aaron, but is this, I wonder what you make of, beyond the context of this interview, the media's ability to make sense of the swing from bad guy to good guy. Some of the this is where we get the kind of woke Al-Qaeda narrative building that's been happening in the press for the last few days.
Yep. That's such a good point. So now now there's this campaign, and it's been going on for a while, to basically rebrand Jolani as a moderate. He used to have a long beard and be in robes. Now he wears a blazer. There was an article in CNN calling him like a blazer wearing revolutionary. The London Telegraph called his group diversity friendly. So there's been a total rebranding going on. It's almost like he's consulting with like Western PR firms.
He's getting the Richard Spencer treatment.
100%. And we saw that. I mean, back when the U.S. was backing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, bin Laden and what became Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, they were presented as freedom fighters. Ronald Reagan called them the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. There was articles in the Western press about how he's a holy warrior on the path to peace.
Isn't like Rambo dedicated to the Mujahideen? Isn't is it Rambo or is it one of those movies?
Well, that's a meme. That's a meme in which I wish that were true, because it's that Rambo movie does totally glamorize them, but it's like that lasting shot where it says this is dedicated. It's actually not in the original movie. It should be, because that's the movie's message, but it's a meme. It's very good though. It looks very convincing, but yeah.
Well, now you know that I've never actually seen Rambo, so.
Well, yeah, I unfortunately have. Although Rambo 1 is a lot different than what came afterwards, but that's a whole other story. Like Rambo 1 is actually a movie about a disgruntled Vietnam veteran who's been abandoned by his country, and then Rambo 2 and 3 is just straight up Reagan era jingoism. But that's your film moment for today's Monday morning. But yeah, so, and like the Azov battalion in Ukraine, right? Prior to Russia invading, they're neo-Nazi. After Russia invading, all of a sudden they're celebrated freedom fighters. It's the same playbook over and over and over. But this is the most explicit sort of rebranding dilemma I think I've ever seen, because the guy's literally, there's a $10 million bounty on his head from the US, as we saw before. And so let's look at how Face the Nation is handling this. We're gonna hear from two guests, Andrew Boyd, who's a former CIA officer, and Muaz Mustafa, who's the head of something called the Syrian Emergency Task Force. Now, what CBS doesn't tell you is that the Syrian Emergency Task Force, which Muaz heads, it's funded by the US government. They do carry out some humanitarian operations in the parts of Syria that the U.S. controls, but they also are there to basically lobby for sanctions that impoverish Syrians, that raise the price of food and fuel, as some U.S. officials have bragged, and that prevent reconstruction of the country. That's also what Muaz Mustafa does as part of the Syrian Emergency Task Force. So that just is some important background here, because he's also been leading this effort to sort of rebrand this Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria. He's in close contact with them, and he's a part of the PR campaign. So watch this interaction that he has with Andrew Boyd, who used to work at CIA and doesn't see this Al-Qaeda offshoot in quite the same way that Muaz Mustafa does.
Revolution to one faction of a coalition, or let's say even one person within a faction in that coalition. Let's discuss that. Why was HTS put on the terrorist list? It was put on a terrorist list over an older version called Jabhat al-Nusra that had a loose affiliation with Al-Qaeda, not a transnational or regional terrorist thing, but an inter-Islamist whatever. I don't agree with any...
But Muaz, I think Margaret's talking also as a person, Abu Muhammad al-Julani. I mean, he was in Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He worked for Abu Musab Zarqawi. He spent several years in Bucca prison as a detainee. You know, so we're talking HTS, Jabhat al-Nusra, but also him as a person. He's designated.
Sure, let's talk about him as a person, but what's hilarious?
So that's actually, that's former CIA guy is accurate. And he's pointing out how crazy it is that we're painting what's now called HTS as sort of like this insurgent group with no ties to Al-Qaeda, when it's led by the guy who founded Al-Qaeda in Syria, Al-Julani, that's his name, and who was the former deputy to Baghdadi, and spent time in a U.S. prison when he was fighting in Iraq. And by the way, he is now again saying that we're going to treat minorities fairly, but he's never apologized for the atrocities committed by his forces when they were going by a different name, al-Nusra, against minorities, including in Latakia, where Human Rights Watch did an investigation of a attack led by al-Nusra, aka Al-Qaeda, in 2013, and they found that Jolani's forces carried out the systematic killing of entire families. I'm quoting directly. So yes, he's now claiming to be a moderate, but he's not renouncing the atrocities that his forces committed under his command. And so that's the awkward dilemma that apologists for the insurgents are facing. And that's a rare moment where someone else actually brings up a semblance of the truth. And so let's see how he handles it.
Hilarious about this is right now, as millions of Syrians come back from Europe and are ready to come back home, as people have not been displaced and there has been zero reports of violations. And I was on the phone with the Bishop of Aleppo. The reason I was on the phone is that President Trump and people in President Trump's camp were concerned about the Christians in Syria. Of course, there's so much focus on, you know, anytime there's something terrorists. And what ended up happening is the Bishop of Aleppo said, sir, first it's the coalition of groups, including HTS, and we have had electricity more now than we have under the regime, and our only fear is Russian airstrikes. So I'm glad that President Trump told Russia what it should do, get out of Syria, and it has done so.
Well, we will be watching to see whether that continues to be the case. And
so again, he doesn't really address the fact that, you know, HTS is led by the founding leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, and he says that there's no reports of violations. That's not true. There's videos that have been putting out of, you know, there was a beheading, at least one beheading that was caught on video, which is a, you know, old tactic of the insurgents. And this is a headline from the Christian Post from just a few days ago. It says, Christians in Syria face uncertain, perilous future under HTS, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the group we're talking about, rebranded Al-Qaeda. Persecution watchdog warns. And, you know, I know myself people from different minority groups in Syria who are very scared, and people are fleeing. And this idea that everything's fine just because Jolani says they'll be protected, it's just I mean,
And people are fleeing, but he's making the argument that people are coming home, Christians are coming home, everybody's repatriating, and the only real fear is Russian airstrikes.
that's what he's saying, yes. And there certainly are people who will come home now because they didn't want to live under Assad. But what he's not saying is that many people are also fleeing because they're worried about a repeat of the same atrocities that Jolani's forces committed when they were trying to overthrow the government. And there's a long record of it. So he's doing his job, which is to whitewash the insurgency. Yeah. Okay. Let's turn to Mark Esper, former defense secretary under Trump, one of those people who participated in basically ignoring Trump's orders to withdraw from Syria and keep U.S. troops there. And also, I believe he's a former Raytheon guy. Certainly has made some money off of these very wars that the U.S. has fueled. So here's Mark Esper speaking to Jake Tapper.
I was texting with a retired general this morning who is very concerned about what's going to happen to Assad's massive arsenal of chemical weapons, to say nothing of the huge cache of surface-to-air missiles in Syria. We're
not going to get into it, but Syria destroyed their chemical weapons arsenal under an agreement brokered by the U.S. and Russia. So I wouldn't assume they do have any chemical weapons left. It's possible that they might. And of course, we're not going to get into it, but the chemical weapons issue, I've done a lot of reporting on this that challenges the mainstream narratives about it. So have others, including Seymour Hersh and Robert Fisk. There's a whole bunch of reporting, but of course, that's a rabbit hole not worth getting into today, but it's just worth noting because the way it's presented in the media is very skewed and doesn't exclude some very key facts, including that whistleblowers at the OPCW challenged the cover-up of their investigation in Syria, which was, they say, and I think they're 100% right, was censored. But anyway, that's a whole other story.
worried are you about those weapons getting into the hands of the rebels, specifically the part of the rebels that is the Islamist militant group HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, whose leader has or had ties to Al-Qaeda?
All right, Jake, that's not bad. He at least acknowledges Al-Qaeda. Sometimes they don't even do that. Now, of course, he didn't just have ties to Al-Qaeda. He was the founding leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, known as al-Nusra, before they changed their name a few times. But not bad from Jake Tapper.
Yeah, I think there are a number of immediate concerns we have to address. There's going to be the humanitarian aid concern, which I think we and other countries in the UN will have to address. I think secondly, as you mentioned, is the chemical weapons and other military capabilities. We do not want those to get into the wrong hands. So there needs to be an effort to secure them or get some assurance from a responsible player that those will be secured and ultimately destroyed. Then I think the bigger question today, Jake, that we were talking about.
By the way, Israel's taking care of that because Israel's just bombing dozens of military sites across Syria, taking out all of Syria's major weapons to ensure that, Syria can never defend itself against Israel, which was a major point of this dirty war to begin with in the first place. So Israel's taking care of that problem already by launching attacks and invading part of Syria already. Israel does not waste an opportunity to invade a neighbor. Brand new Syria, brand new Israeli invasion. Okay, more Esper.
Yesterday was who is going to govern Syria and what will it look like, right? We do not want a return of, we don't want it to look like the ISIS caliphate. So that'd be another immediate concern. We don't want it to look like the Taliban rule. We don't want it to look like a theocracy in Iran. So the question is, what will it look like under HTS and this really diverse group of rebel factions, everything from Christians to Druze, Sunnis and Shias, Kurds, secular, non-secular, what will it look like? And,
Okay, I don't know what he's talking about there. He says the rebel faction is diverse and it includes Christians and Druze. I mean, I'm not an expert on Syria, so maybe there's something I'm missing here, but I've never heard of a Christian rebel group fighting on behalf of the Al-Qaeda led insurgency.
Yeah, it really is fascinating the quickness with which conservatives will start to leverage a sort of bizarre identity politics when they want to rehabilitate someone that's on side.
Yes. It's like the same people who make fun of like woke people, quote unquote, will happily adopt that playbook when it serves their interests. Just like they weaponize identity politics to accuse any critic of Israel of being an anti-Semite. It's a similar playbook here, but literally, I don't know what he's talking about. I think he's making that up about this diverse group of, including Druze and Christian. when Al-Qaeda, aka al-Nusra, aka HTS, took over Idlib with U.S. help back in 2015, they massacred Druze and they expelled pretty much all the Christians. The Christian population of Idlib went from about 1,200 to literally 3 people, if those 3 people are even left. I'm not sure if they're even left anymore. So I don't know what he's talking about, except making it up to whitewash the rebels, quote unquote, and how diverse they are. So that's Mark Esper. Yeah.
Aaron, how cynical are you about this? Do you think this is not just sort of media messaging, but also kind of a direct message that says, we'll let you be in charge, we'll let you maintain control HTS if you just actually execute on this rebrand, if you don't repeat the war crimes of the past, if you do stay secular, if you the way that in so many instances America sets the tone of the regimes that we put into power, and they're allowed to stay in power as long as they follow America's rules, that this is kind of like the open political version of the behind the scenes signaling that's going on? Or do you think that America doesn't really have an interest in HTS staying in power for the long term, and that really ultimately they're hoping that Israel, frankly, exerts the kind of influence that they would like to see in the region?
I think people like Esper represent an element in Washington that is trying to push this rebranding. Like, yeah, they're moderate rebels now. They're moderate. He's changed his ways. They're diverse. But whether that will succeed, I just don't know. Like, how do you get away with saying that we have to oppose Assad because he's a tyrant and he's committed atrocities, to welcoming the rule of a guy who's the founder of Al-Qaeda in Syria and a former deputy to leader of ISIS?
But they are doing it,
I know.
right? Aren't they
I've
kind of
getting away with it?
I was listening to Pod Save did a very special episode on this yesterday, I think with Tommy Vitor and another guy. I can never get them straight. And the part of for the first half of it or so I listened to, it wasn't that I feel like they were saying that much that was incorrect, but the emphasis was so heavy on how horrible Assad is, that the rest of it got yada yada yada. What's going to happen in the vacuum just gets yada yada yada, and that does a lot of work for people to just kind of accept this as like a good versus evil story and celebrate and move on.
Well, if I know you're an avid listener to Pod Save. You're an avid hate listener, and so I'm guessing if this was the foreign policy show they do, I'm guessing it was maybe Ben Rhodes.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So Ben Rhodes is a senior official under Obama. And it's interesting. He, has a memoir that has some very revealing stuff, and he writes in it that basically when he was in office under Obama, he was trying to get HTS, aka Al-Qaeda, not placed on the terrorism list. He says, and I have the quote here. He says that HTS, Al-Qaeda, quote, was probably the strongest fighting force within the opposition, and U.S.-backed groups, he says, quote, were fighting side by side with al-Nusra. And then he goes on to say that if we put Nusra on the terror list, this, quote, would alienate the same people we want to help. Okay, so he fought against putting HTS on the terror list because he didn't want to alienate the strongest fighting force in the opposition, which he knew was Al-Qaeda. Now, what that move did, though, is by putting HTS on the terror list, it meant that the U.S. couldn't directly supply Al-Qaeda, but they could still supply other insurgent groups that weren't on the list, which ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda. And that's how Al-Qaeda took Idlib, is by taking weapons that were given to other groups and using them. So whether that will succeed now, I somehow doubt it. I think they'll probably pick someone who is tight with Jelani and HTS, but it can be like, has their hands clean of being directly involved, but they'll still do, like HTS will still have a very big role because they're the ones who led the insurgency, and their militias are around the country. And by the way, when it comes to diversity, it's not like, when you speak about, they are diverse in that they include groups that are not even Syrian, but come from around the world, like Uzbekistan and Xinjiang in China. Like there's a Uyghur militia inside Syria. And this is what's being called a strong element of the, quote, Syrian revolution, is people who aren't even Syrian. So that's the diversity really that the insurgents represent. People came in from around the world to wage, what they call jihad, what other Muslims would say is a complete perversion of Islam, but that's what they did. And that is the real diversity, I think, of the insurgent groups that Mark Esper is talking about. But whether they'll succeed, it's a great question. You'd think at this point, you can't get away with that. But I guess in Washington, any rebranding is possible if you're on the side of the elite.
Yeah. All right. What have we got next?
Okay, well, let's skip ahead to, let's just do one more clip. This is, we've heard the clip of Trump before saying we're in Syria to take the oil. Let's hear it from someone who's more refined, someone who is not like the brazen blowhard that Trump is, was a senior official for Biden in the Pentagon, and was responsible for Syria policy. And back in 2019, when she was heading something called the Syria Study Group for Congress, she explained how the U.S. can control Syria's state by occupying its resources. So this is Dana Stroul, a former senior Pentagon official, speaking in 2019.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military.
So notice the language there. We owned 1/3 of Syria. We owned. And this is like, a normal bureaucrat just speaking so casually about how we own 1/3 of Syria, which speaks to my point. Assad was not the only authoritarian force inside of Syria. There also was the authoritarian force that came from the outside, including the U.S., that decided we can pillage Syria's oil, we can own Syria's oil and wheat, and we can do that to impose what we want on Syria, which is leadership that is compliant to us. And that is, and to achieve that goal, we flooded Syria with weapons that went to an Al-Qaeda dominated insurgency. We imposed sanctions that further impoverished Syrians, made it impossible to rebuild. And we stole their oil and wheat, as Dana Stroul is explaining here.
Only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict.
So it's just mafia talk. We have leverage because we're stealing the 1/3 of Syria, their resource-rich region, not just the oil, but also where Syria grows, food. And she's bragging about that.
Yeah, there's an establishment kind of criticism of the left that pops up every time there's some foreign policy conflict that says, oh, the left just has an America bad lens and they paint America as a cartoon villain, and it negatively affects their ability to have any sophisticated analysis of global events. And then you hear this and you think we're not painting America as cartoonishly evil enough. They just say it.
They just say it. Yeah, they just say it. Yeah. And they think it's the natural way of things, that we have the right to just pillage another country's oil.
The hydrocarbons.
The hydrocarbons, yeah. So that is the situation in Syria. Obviously, a lot more to come, and things are unfolding, minute by minute. But what a change, and a total success for the people who've flooded Syria with weapons, tried to destroy the country to have regime change, and they've succeeded. And we saw what happened in Iraq and Libya. Syria's already seen so much carnage. And we can all hope that things will not go the way it's gone in Syria for the last 10 years. And that, at least now, see, this is the U.S. playbook. You destroy a country where people finally give up and cave and you win. And then you lift the sanctions that have made life impossible. You say, look how great things are now that the ruler we wanted gone is now gone. And, it's so cynical, it's cruel, but let's hope at least that these sanctions will be lifted, because no matter who is ruling Syria, sanctions always punish innocent civilians. That's the goal of these sanctions. As actually Dana Stroul also says later on in that clip, that, we can hold a card, she says, on reconstruction, because most of the country is rubble. So let's hope at least that Syrian people won't continue to suffer under policies that we can control, such as sanctions.
Yeah. I mean, is that kind of where you've landed sort of when you're trying to think of sort of the moral weighting of this shift, I mean, I as you've so, competently explained, the sort of bad faith reasons why America is involved, the proxy war nature of it all of these things being what they are, there is still this, if there's so many bad actors, if Assad is also a bad actor, you see these people getting released from prison, these political prisoners and the like. Of course, there's the frustration that the mainstream media is framing this as a war for justice and freedom in America, swooping in Captain America style and saving saving persecuted people the way that we always do. Think of the women and children, all of those kinds of things, and that it's a lie, and that's frustrating to hear. But I do think there is like this weird grasping for sort of a moral accounting, people trying to frame this as a sort of a good thing or a bad thing. And I do wonder how you would describe it, like what you would say to someone who is trying to figure out a kind of moral footing in the grand scheme of this all.
I mean, the moral footing to me is that we have no right to interfere in that country and to fuel an insurgency dominated by Al-Qaeda. I mean, look at the freak out here about January 6th, a 3-hour riot or insurrection, if you want to call it. What right do we have to spend tens of billions of dollars, along with our allies, flooding a country with weapons, and then when that failed, imposing sanctions that hurt ordinary civilians, and then military occupying 1/3 of Syria? So, we had no right to be there, and Syria should be left to Syrians themselves. And, my answer in all these places were on the side of overthrowing a government that is authoritarian and repressive, as is the case with Syria, is like, if we weren't doing that, if the country wasn't being targeted with regime change for decades, by the way, the U.S. has been trying to overthrow the Assad dynasty for decades, would things be any different? Because one of the things you do when you try to overthrow a government is you encourage repression. You force people, because if you open up your country, the U.S. will come in and, with, all the money in the world to fund NGOs and media outlets to destabilize the country and have, encourage leaders that we want. So the answer to me is always let Syrians decide for themselves. Be happy for people who are being freed from prisons, the political prisoners. There's many of them. Be happy for people who are feeling some joy that, a government that repressed them has been ousted. But also remember that, Syria is not a monolith. And there are many Syrians now who are scared about the new rulers. And we're responsible for what our government does, not what Syria's government does. And we shouldn't be authoritarians as well by deciding who should be able to rule over Syria. And on the images of the prisons, it's totally fair to be, heartened by the sights of free people. How can you not? But notice how there was back when Syrians were being liberated from the dungeons of US-backed and US allied-backed insurgent groups, such as Jaish al-Islam and Duma, which held people in dungeons and tortured them and all, put people in cages. You don't see that being circulated in the media because that went against the narrative. So no country is a monolith. And you have to remember there are people who have suffered under the groups that we backed, and they will never see justice. And certainly they won't see justice now because those very same groups are now in charge and they've won.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the same thing with, Iraq. Like Saddam was a tyrant, committed all these atrocities. Was Iraq better off with living under sanctions by the US and then being invaded and overthrown? Same thing with Libya. Gaddafi was an authoritarian. Is Libya better off? So A, I don't think we have the right to do regime change, and B, when has it ever benefited the people of the targeted country?
Yeah.
But those are my thoughts on it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, we can move on.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's up next? We're done with the Syria segment of the morning.
We're done with the Syria portion of the morning. Let's turn to the incoming president, Donald Trump. He sat down for an interview with Meet the Press, and we wanted to play just a few of some of the best clips. Remember during the campaign when Trump talked about having a concept of a plan for healthcare, but not an actual plan? Well, here he is being asked about that once again.
And then he voted against. Nobody understands it.
Sir, you said during the campaign you had concepts of a plan. Do you have an actual plan at this point for health care?
Yes, we have concepts of a plan that would be better.
Still just concepts? Do you have a fully developed plan?
Let me explain. We have the biggest healthcare companies looking at it. We have doctors. We're always looking because Obamacare stinks. It's lousy. there are better answers. If we come up with a better answer, I would present that answer to Democrats.
I love this. There are better answers. If we come up with one, we'll let you know. So the problem is there is a better answer, right? There is. It's called Medicare for all, but he'll never embrace that. So all he can do is point out that Obamacare stinks, but he can't come up with an answer because the only answer is one that he'll never support because it means giving everybody health care.
Yeah, so my hot take on this is that obviously Trump is silly and dumb, and the media doing the victory lap around him saying this concept of the plan nonsense during the primary was one of their fairer hits. That being said, it's embarrassing for Democrats that he is able to get away with saying like stuff like this and win precisely because, well, while he doesn't have anything more than concepts of a plan, he does have a really clear target, which is the status quo healthcare system being abominable in the direct experience of hundreds of millions of Americans. So that line that, Obamacare sucks, the status quo sucks, whatever exactly he said, does, I think, ring truer in a lot of people's minds than the journalists, the Democrat position, which is just stick with the status quo, because they don't have anything more than concepts of a plan to reform it as well, because as you pointed out, there's a bipartisan consensus that we're not going to embrace Medicare for all. And that's why this moment right now with the claims adjuster is so sort of revealing and, dare I say, sort of energizing, because you are seeing the elites across the political spectrum line up to say you're a very, very bad person for thinking that there's anything kind of schadenfreude or, deserved about, or it's just an expression of well-founded sentiment, even if you don't support vigilante assassinations about what's going on here. Oh, you're just a very bad person. Finger wagging coming from the left and from people like Ben Shapiro. But then you go into the comment section of Ben Shapiro and you see a bunch of conservative viewers saying, no, you're wrong. The health insurance industry, Brian Thompson, all of these companies, they killed my wife. They killed my child. They killed my mother. They killed my brother. And you're the person who's deeply out of touch and elitist to ask me to feel more grief than you've ever showed for any of our loved ones for this perversely wealthy multi-millionaire who even internally in his own company was facing all of this scrutiny and all of this criticism from his own employees because they feel constrained and horrible about themselves for having to enact the policy to have a 33% denial rate on these claims.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It is, yes, pathetic that Trump and the Republicans have had all of this time to come up with an alternative and haven't, but also a real vulnerability for Democrats that they can't just kind of point their finger at Donald Trump and get out of. He won despite the kind of emptiness of his argument.
Amen. Let's finish out this clip and then we'll hear, speaking of, ways in which Trump exploited the Democrats' weakness and just hypocrisy. We'll hear another clip on that theme, but let's finish out this clip here about Trump and healthcare.
And to everybody else, and I do something about it, but until we have that, or until they can approve it, but we're not going to go through the big deal. I am the one that saved Obamacare, I will say, and I did the right thing. I could have done the more political thing and killed it, and all I had to do is starve it to death.
You did try to have your Justice Department effectively kill it, though.
No, kill it from a legal standpoint, but from a physical standpoint, I made it work.
In your
I try to make sense of that, and also he tried to repeal it. He tried to repeal it when in John McCain, spoiled his plans when he put it down. So I don't know what he's talking about, but that's hilarious. He tried to kill it.
Legally, but not physically. No, I didn't straddle and then try to choke out healthcare. I just legally tried to kill it. Yeah, he's a funny one.
All right. Well, so you mentioned Trump exploiting Democrats, just elitism and being so out of touch. Well, here he is talking about
being
that.
Captured. Just yeah.
Yes, being captured. So here's Trump more. Here's more of Trump on that theme.
I won on two things: the border. And more than immigration, they like to say immigration. I break it down more to the border, but I won on the border and I won on groceries. It's a very simple word, groceries. Like almost, who uses the word? I started using the word, the groceries. When you buy apples, when you buy bacon, when you buy eggs, they would double and triple the price. over a short period of time. And I won an election based on that. We're going to bring those prices way down.
I want to pause here because
See, he's almost amused there because like he's saying groceries is some sort of exotic word, right? Because of course he never buys groceries. His servants do, his aides do. But it's like he's saying it's almost like this like exotic thing that he just happened to come across that helped him get across the finish line, because Democrats again were so bad on the fact that food costs more money. And he was like, this is wow, look, this thing called grocery. I can use this to win. And he did.
Yeah, it's almost like he can't believe how easy it was.
Yeah.
And he can't believe how wide open the lane was left by the Democrats for him just to swoop in and say, have you heard of this thing? Groceries. Groceries. Have you heard of it? Apples. Bacon.
Yeah. Aaron, have you seen that clip from MSNBC where it's from Morning Joe, and there's this a Democratic pundit, and he says that because of relatively inconsequential things like the higher price of eggs, that's how MAGA people get channeled into fascism and sexism, basically, because of relatively inconsequential like so the term was minor inconveniences. And that kind of elitism and smugness is what Trump exploited, even though he doesn't even understand what groceries are.
Yeah, I had Fidel Kaboub, the economist, on the show, like on Bad Faith, maybe like a year or so ago, and I always come back to it because it was a conversation about inflation, and he really broke it down, because inflation is talked about like it's like this magical sort of vibe in the air, instead of just being like when corporations raise prices. When prices go up, it's inflation, and they can go up sort of in a kind of, you can argue, market-based logical sort of way, supply and demand way, and they can go up in a usurious I'm price gouging you sort of a way, and you can talk about it. But the takeaway that really resonated with me is that there's these four principal sectors that are driving inflation, and it is food, housing, transportation, healthcare, and maybe like education. And when you look at it from that kind of sectoral analysis, and you say, what's going on with food? The Democrats are hand waving away, as you just pointed out, the impact of rising grocery prices. Okay. And you get the Biden administration putting out these little like infographics saying, oh, Thanksgiving is cheaper this year. It only costs $45 to feed a family of 10. And of course, there's the expected outrage from that. When you see a complete indifference, frankly, to rising education costs, where you have Joe Biden like float a student debt program that was designed to fail, and that he's still trying to take credit for, even though it went from ostensibly impacting 44 million Americans to impacting very, very, very few. When you see absolutely nothing being done from a housing context, Kamala doing one of her weird neoliberal plans that was a lie in the end of the day anyway, like a $25,000 tax cut that never was going to be. And when you go down the line of all of these big ticket items, transportation, cost of gas, all of those things, cost of gas, which is being driven up also by the conflict in Ukraine, it becomes patently obvious how the Democratic Party offered no solutions and were doing, CYA, covering their own tuckuses. And that's how you get this. That's how you get Donald Trump, a billionaire with a golden elevator and a golden toilet, being able to hop on the television and say groceries a few times, and genuinely coming across as more in touch with the working classes than the Democratic Party and their Tony Wests and their I don't think billionaires are the real problem sort of narrative.
Here's that clip I mentioned from MSNBC about how the cost of eggs was just a minor annoyance.
Particularly the media ecosystem, it's not a good one. It's a negative one. It's a radicalization funnel. But what they have done in their online media ecosystem is build a radicalization engine, literally the way militant groups do around the world, that takes people from relatively low-level annoyances with the world. Why are eggs so expensive? Why is my kid learning this new thing in American history in school that I didn't learn? And then moves them through YouTube videos, through podcasts, moves them from that annoyance all the way slowly to a full-blown fascist politics.
So there it is.
Yeah. And then this reminds me of at one point during the Bernie campaign, I got in trouble because a journalist asked me, what did I think about Russia radicalizing Black Americans by pointing out that America had been bad on race politics to Black people. And I was like, well, putting aside the idea that Black people only realized racism was happening because Russia told them to, what's the lie? Like the idea that like it's wrong to be radicalized because of grocery prices. It's wrong to be radicalized by structural racism. It's wrong like, no, if you don't want other people to be able to exploit the real harms that you're experiencing, then cure them. Don't expect me to give up my concerns because like Russia shares them, because MAGA shares them, or at least is pretending to share them. It's absurd.
Totally agreed. And these clips are, it's like, these clips are just he talks there about like radicalizing Trump's base. Well, clips like this where you're calling the price of eggs a relatively low level annoyance, if that's the message being displayed from Democratic elites to MAGA people, they're going to be radicalized even more, because for people, working people, actually, it's not a low level annoyance that the price of food is higher. And I can't believe we even have to deliver that message to people who are paid to do politics for a living.
Yeah.
All right. Well, listen, you mentioned this, the murder of the United Healthcare executive, Brian Thompson, has just sparked a wave of a really interesting online reaction where people are sharing their stories of their, being ripped off and being denied vital care for themselves and their loved ones by healthcare executives, and how this is one of those moments where it's forced to debate. This murder is forced to debate on something. There's a fundamental problem in this country, which is that we deny people the right to healthcare. So Ro Khanna, Congressmember Ro Khanna, who you've interviewed several times, Bree, he went on ABC to discuss the backlash and this controversy.
Sparked shock, but also a cascade of vitriolic comments online towards insurers about the high costs of health care, many with a blatant lack of sympathy towards the murder victim. Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna joins me now, and this is obviously just a horrendous crime, but has this online vitriol surprised you?
Well, first of all, let me just say it was horrific. I mean, this is a father we're talking about of two children, and my sympathies to the entire family. There is no justification for violence. But the outpouring afterwards has not surprised me. Look, I, as a congressperson, had United Healthcare deny a prescription for a nasal $100 pump spray, and I couldn't get them to reverse this. So imagine what ordinary people are dealing with. The biggest denial comes when it's cancer treatment. I mean, people are getting denied on cancer treatment. And my view is very simple. Why can't we have a rule that if a doctor prescribes something, and if Medicare, traditional Medicare, is going to cover it, then private insurance companies should be forced to cover it? I mean, it's absurd in this country what's going on.
I want to, you retweeted a post by Bernie Sanders that said, yes, we waste hundreds of billions a year on healthcare administrative expenses that make insurance CEOs and wealthy stockholders incredibly rich, while 85 million Americans go uninsured or underinsured. Healthcare is a human right. We need Medicare for all. But that's not really going to happen. So what would you say to those Americans who are frustrated right now?
So, Bree, I'm curious your reaction to that. She just declares it's not going to happen. We're not going to have Medicare for all. So, yeah.
This is how they get away with it. This is how, even in the wake of an incredible amount of public outrage, which, by the way, is not just online. It's not online outrage. I don't know a single person in the world that I've spoken to over the course of the last few days who hasn't shared this sentiment. And people are getting texts from their apolitical normie parents saying, oh, well, like this isn't some like bloodthirst for murder. These are normie people who have been so personally affected in ways that have actually resulted in deaths. Not just the one death of the one man with the one family we're supposed to feel sympathy for, but literally tens of thousands of deaths in the United States of America every single year because of the actions of Brian Thompson and other CEOs and people in leadership positions at these companies and the politicians who protect them. They all have the same shared sentiment because they have been personally negatively affected in ways that never get this kind of sympathy chorus from the mainstream news. So yeah, like I appreciate the pushback that kind of offers there in a second. It's more than we normally get off the mainstream, but the fact that she's able to slip in the face of this public outcry, oh, Medicare for all is just never going to happen, as though we are not alone among peer nations in not having a single payer healthcare system, as though I'm like not sitting here and talking to a real life breathing Canadian and not an alien from outer space where they've managed to hack healthcare. No, here on planet Earth, other people have figured it out. And the fact that you can be a highly paid pundit in the middle of a national crisis, a national healthcare crisis, and get away with saying something like that is unconscionable. Oh, by the way,
Bernie Sanders
sorry,
is absolutely right. I believe we can.
Sorry.
Not to belabor this, but one other point there is like the emphasis on Brian Thompson's family. Like I'm a humanist. I am not indifferent to interpersonal pain. I don't want to be the kind of person and be in a place just for my own personal like ethics and morals where I am indifferent to the innocent people, but his family members, etc. But I also want to point out that in other kinds of killings, when we're talking about members of Hamas, for instance, that have been killed and all the collateral damage and all of their family members, the Project Lavender, the kind of the AI that Israel has been using that factors in 100 innocents that can be killed alongside of them. The pager attack that killed all of these superfluous innocent people. The way that the AI is targeting people who are in your cell phone plan as suspected terrorists, and the implications of what that means for just murdering the extended family members of people who might have had a very attenuated connection to Hamas. At no point during any of these conversations on the establishment news was there ever a moment of sympathy for the family members that were killed, and the idea that the killing of those primary actors wasn't justified, despite how maybe undesirable it was to have collateral damage. And now I'm supposed to have this outpouring of sympathy for this one man's family in a very selective way that, again, none of the people who have been harmed, who've suffered and died at the hands of the American healthcare system have had even a fraction of the sympathy that we're supposed to have for a handful of individuals who happen to be the beneficiaries, at least financially, of the healthcare grift.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how some murder is totally normalized, and whereas other acts of violence and killing, those become the problem because they raise some sort of threat to the system. In this case,
yeah, but if it's on a spreadsheet, it's fine. They said they sound like Donald Trump. Actually, I didn't physically kill healthcare. I just tried to kill it on a ballot legally. How is that any different from saying, oh, I didn't? Brian Thompson didn't pull the trigger and literally murder anybody. He just killed tens of thousands of people on some spreadsheet somewhere through some denial claims.
Medicare for All happened. He was retweeting Elon Musk, who was pointing out that the United States spends the most on administrative waste. If you care about efficiency in government, Medicare is 2% administrative fees. The private insurance, 18% that they're wasting. But as we fight for Medicare for All, what we can do is require private insurance to cover anything that Medicare would cover. We can require a cap on out-of-pocket costs. We have to understand people with cancer, with heart disease, with diabetes, with insurance aren't getting the care that they need. They're getting stuck with huge medical bills. And Bernie Sanders and I also have a bill to end medical bankruptcy. But finally, after years, Sanders is winning this debate, and we should be moving towards Medicare for All.
You mentioned Bernie Sanders responding to Elon Musk. What he actually said is, shouldn't the American people be getting their money's worth? He and Vivek Ramaswamy have been asked by President Trump to lead the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. What do you think they could do in terms of health care realistically?
Well, they should look at the extraordinary waste, and they will find that CBO has said Medicare is the most efficient, and they should be looking at where the private health care costs are. But there are other areas that Bernie Sanders and I have said we could work together on the defense costs. Defense contractors. Look, Lockheed Martin has, with the F-35s, has gone about $200 billion over. There is waste when it comes to breast pumps being purchased at $1,400 instead of $200. Soap dispensers, $150,000 we paid Boeing for soap dispensers. That's the waste they should go after. Now, there are places I disagree, Martha. They should not touch a penny of Social Security. They should not touch the CFPB. They should not touch Medicare in terms of this funding.
Well, Martha Raddatz, I'm sure, does not agree with his suggestion that we cut the Pentagon budget because, of course, we have to continue using that money on weapons contractors rather than giving everybody health care.
Yeah, look, and while, again, I appreciate Ro Khanna's pushback, I would like a world where he says just very plainly Medicare for all. It's the solution. Single payer healthcare is the solution. The rest of the developed first, whatever, global north has come up with. And it is unconscionable that we are paying twice as much for our healthcare and not even getting healthcare, just getting an insurance system that fails millions of Americans on a regular basis, that's designed to fail, that has a 33% failure rate, at least when we're talking about United Health Services. It's worth also noting that it was the Republican CBO report in 2020 that found that a Medicare for All initiative would save America an estimated $650 billion a year. $650 billion a year. This is not a charity case. This is an efficiency argument. And I know there's been a debate about whether or not people like Bernie and Ro Khanna should be sort of yes-anding this DOJ stuff and like giving it any sort of veneer of authenticity or like credibility, because ultimately they obviously don't care about that. They want to cut Social Security. This is a austerity campaign. And I do think that there is a way that they could probably do a better job of making it clear that they think that the DOJ people are acting in bad faith. That being said, this is an opportunity that's opened up to go on TV and be invited to talk about healthcare and to not take that moment to say Medicare for all is not a pie in the sky dream. We're not Hillary Clinton. It's not 2016. It's incredibly viable, and here's how it works. And I was reminded of this because with all of the Pod John stuff happening and all of the what happened in the election, come to Jesus moments that have been happening, the Hassan Piker interview on Pod Save and all of that. I reflected on when I interviewed Jon Favreau for the Bernie campaign on the Bernie podcast, Hear the Burn. And it's funny to watch because my hands are very much tied. I have to be so nice and polite and non-confrontational because I'm speaking on behalf of the campaign. But we got into it a little bit about healthcare and how he was like, well, yeah, Kamala's healthcare plan is basically the same as Bernie's. And they were all doing this sleight of hand where they pretended that if I just say the words Medicare for all, I actually support a single payer healthcare system, even though obviously we remember that Kamala Harris very quickly retracted her support for single payer after she had raised her hand with Bernie saying that she supported it on the debate stage. And why did I bring this up? I was looking at that Pod Save American interview, and it's incredible because when Bernie went on Pod Save during that election cycle, this interview reminded me that he took the time in the 60 seconds it takes to explain how Medicare for All could actually be enacted. We have a Medicare program. It already is covering the elderly. In the first year of Medicare for All, you just drop the eligibility age by 10 years. The second year, you drop it by another 10 years. And the third year, you cover everybody. So the first year, you also do 18 and under. So over a 4-year period, you simply expand the eligibility of Americans in age-related chunks until everybody is covered. And I remember asking Jon Favreau, had he ever really heard it explain it like that before? Wasn't it so compelling? So it's so infrequent that you give someone the opportunity on a mainstream platform like that to really concretize what it would mean to have Medicare for all. And I think that by doing that, Bernie doing that, it made it feel real and it made it feel possible. And I do just hope going forward, this isn't a criticism, more of a suggestion, that when Ro Khanna and others who are being invited to talk about this because of the assassination, that they will consider actually trying to make more tangible the possibility of Medicare for all by talking about it and treating about it like it's a real policy and not just a campaign era political slogan.
What is that line from Hillary Clinton where she says, she was like, I think she was referring to Bernie. She said, this idea of single payer healthcare will never, ever happen, and she was so
Yep.
emphatic about it. And
Yep.
that is the message that everyone's just in lockstep with. And I think maybe people in the Bernie camp are like, it's so drilled into everyone's heads that it's never ever going to happen, that they're timid and trying to actually advocate for it because of just the intense resistance to it from Hillary Clinton on down.
Yep. 100%.
All right. Well, we've come to the end of the show. Bree, thank you so much for sitting in for Katie. We really appreciate it. Anything you want to plug before we go? How can people follow you? How can people support Bad Faith?
Well, first, I want to remind everyone to like this stream, subscribe to this channel, and share where you can. With respect to me, you can find me over on Bad Faith Podcast, wherever you get your podcast. Free episodes drop every Thursday. You can also watch them. I prefer to watch them on Bad Faith YouTube. I appreciate subscriptions to that channel as well. And if you want an additional episode of Bad Faith every week, there are premium episodes at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast that drop every Monday, including today, where I talk about the claims adjuster with Nathan Robinson, and also go through some of the flack that he got for, I think, saying the obvious about the claims adjuster, which is that the public outrage about that basically you should live your life. You should live your life in a way that people aren't happy when you die, which of course got a whole pile on from a bunch of right-wingers who've never had any lapse in their healthcare coverage, and from liberals and centrists as well, who would prioritize the sentiments of one man's life and one family's life over, again, tens of thousands of Americans every single year. And additionally, I am a little reluctant to promote it because I've been slagging off a little, but I'm getting back into doing these radars over on my Substack, which is called Briefly. I'm calling the radars debriefs now. Radars is what we call them, obviously, on Rising. And there should be a new one out this week. So if you're interested in that sort of a format, I am getting back into that over on Substack.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. And for those who don't know or don't remember, Bree left Rising at the Hill, where she was a very popular host because of her stance on Israel, so opposing the genocide.
Left is a nice way to put it.
Well,
given the boot.
Just like Katie, you were given the boot, and I'm your radars were always so insightful and informative. So I'm really happy to hear that you're doing them again. And so that's on your Substack, which is called Briefly.
Briefly, yes, like Brie. I'm in my pun era.
Which Katie also would appreciate. I mean, she's the queen.
I think so.
Yes. And one thing I wanted to mention, speaking of Palestine, we didn't cover it today because because of the news in Syria. But of course, the genocide is ongoing. Massacres by Israel are continuing apace, and it's important, with all the carnage now going on in Syria and all the turmoil, just to remember that Gaza is still going on. There's still a genocide there, and that should remain, for those who care about genocide, our top focus. And of course, we'll all be continuing to cover it. All right, Bree, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to everyone who tuned in and joined us live, or if you're listening to or watching this later, we really appreciate it. Our website is usefulidiots.podcast.com. Go there to support the show and get bonus content. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.